We're about to start. It's quite a crowd we have here, 30 people. We had about 50 people sign up, so I'm sure others will be arriving in the next few minutes. My name is Aldo Lauria Santiago. I am director of the Center for Latin American Studies that is sponsoring this talk and many others, and I'll put in the chat the web address for the center. The Center for Latin American Studies at Rutgers, in case there's any confusion. So I'd like to welcome all of you in our online format, continued Zooming. Today we have, as part of our ongoing speaker series, Professor Aviva Chomsky from Salem State College. University, that's right. It's what I put in my notes. That's right. Avi Chomsky is probably the best example that I know of a activist scholar and prolific in both ends. And maybe she can talk a little bit about that. She's been in many different campaigns as well as many different research and publication projects. I've known her for about 25 years. We did a book together, edited a book together on Central America and the Caribbean 25 years ago, more or less, that give or take a COVID year, that still sells. So, which is actually kind of cool. Avi studied at the University of California, Berkeley, practically her entire career there. She got her PhD in history. She teaches history, Latin America, and Latino studies, Latino history as well. She's the author of many books, some of them oriented towards changing the world, others towards educating academics, more specialized, among them Undocumented How Immigration Became Illegal, A History of the Cuban Revolution, Linked Labor Histories, New England, Colombia, and the Making of a Global Working Class, The People Behind Colombian Coal, They Take Our Jobs, and 20 Other Myths About Immigration. And she is also the author of the book that is the subject of today's presentation, Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration, published in 2021. There it is, by Beacon Press. So just a couple of format issues. We are recording the session, just so you are aware. If you have noticed on the Zoom, we will have Avi speak for about 20 minutes. 50 minutes. And then we'll have at least 20 to 30 minutes for discussion. I'd like to encourage people to ask questions, to actually turn on their cameras and ask a question. But if you don't like doing that, you can put it in the chat and I will package them or put them in chronological order or something so that I can then present them to her if the time allows, right? So without more intervention on my part, Avi, welcome to Virtual Rutgers.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And thanks, Aldo, and to the Center for Caribbean and Latin American Studies for organizing this. I'm excited to be here. And I have to say, it's really a pleasure to be able to do talks by Zoom so that I could teach my 2 classes this morning, go to a emergency faculty meeting, and then teach my class this afternoon and be home to babysit tonight. So there's definitely some advantages to Zoom. So thank you for describing me as an activist scholar. That's definitely how I think of myself. And when I first got the idea to write this book, and I proposed it to Beacon Press, and I've published some of my academic books with academic presses, and I've published several of my activist books with Beacon Press. And I conceived of this as an activist book. And that's why I approached Beacon Press with the idea, and they loved the idea. And so I went with it. But as I wrote, it started turning into more of what I see as kind of a crossover book, scholarly activist, because I realized that it writing what I intended to be the activist book raised so many theoretical and scholarly questions that I felt hadn't really been fully addressed by the literature either, or that were just really intriguing to me. So it ended up going more in a scholarly direction than I intended, even though I still really tried to keep it accessible for a general audience. So that was what I was thinking about. I'll tell you more about how I came to write the book. But I did also just want to mention that when I proposed we came to the title a little bit later in the process, but once we got to the title, Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration, I had no idea yet that President Biden was going to come into office with his new project, which now seems to have been forgotten, but in the first few months of the Biden administration was talked about a lot, of attacking migration at the roots and getting to the roots of migration. And he said that Biden and Kamala Harris kept talking about how the roots of migration were poverty and violence. And I thought, well, you're just beginning to answer the question about the roots of migration, because you say that poverty and violence are the roots of migration, but what are the roots of poverty and violence? Like, it's not enough to just say that poverty and violence are the roots of migration. What are the roots of poverty and violence? And then I thought, well, I guess I chose, even though he plagiarized it a little bit, I chose a really good title for my books, having it like appear just as all of this talk was happening in the political sphere. So yeah, I actually wanted to start by talking a little bit about how I came to write the book, why I conceived it the way I did, and my sort of trajectory as a scholar activist. So when I started graduate school in 1982 at Berkeley, obviously Central America was very much a topic at the front of everybody's minds. The Nicaraguan Revolution happened in 1979. There were ongoing revolutions in Guatemala and El Salvador. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. For those of you who don't remember those years as clearly as I do, some of us do, I guess. So Central America was on the front pages. And Ronald Reagan, of course, came into office with this idea that Nicaragua was closer to Texas than Texas was to Washington, D.C. or something. And the Nicaraguan Revolution posed this existential threat to the existence of the United States, and that his foreign policy goals were going to be aimed directly at overthrowing the Nicaraguan Revolution with what came to be known as the Contra War, and preventing the revolutionary movements in Guatemala and El Salvador from being successful and taking power. And the Salvadorans were saying, "Si Nicaragua venció, El Salvador vencerá." If Nicaragua triumphed, El Salvador will triumph. And Ronald Reagan was intent on undoing both of those. Nicaragua was not allowed. Nicaragua's triumph was not allowed to be fulfilled, and El Salvador was not going to be allowed to triumph. During those years, so a lot of us in my cohort were working in solidarity with revolutionary Nicaragua, with the revolutionary movements in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and opposing US policy in Central America. And that was really what prompted me to go back to graduate school, and being very angry about what was happening, but also realizing that I really didn't understand why all this was happening. And the more I sort of on my own started looking into it, it's like, wow, there's this whole history of the United States in Central America that I knew nothing about. And why didn't I know anything about it? So, so going back to graduate school and focusing on Latin American history, and obviously eventually getting my PhD. But at the same time, a lot of refugees from Guatemala and El Salvador in particular were coming into the San Francisco Bay Area and Berkeley and Oakland. And so part of solidarity work was also working with refugees, many of whom were undocumented, and trying to, like, the context of US policy in Central America also shaped the context of US refugee policy, which recognized refugees essentially as refugees from communism. So if you were fleeing from anything besides communism, you didn't get to be counted as a refugee. And especially if you were fleeing from a government that the United States was supporting, the United States couldn't acknowledge that those governments, right-wing military dictatorships in El Salvador and Guatemala were creating refugees. So understanding immigration policy as part of foreign policy was also something that it wasn't really part of my studies, but it was kind of happening while I was involved in these different kinds of activism and academics in graduate school. So there weren't a lot of Central American historians before our generation, mine and Aldo's. And I feel like those of us who began graduate school in the 1980s, really, there were very few mentors for us, at least in terms of Central American history. And now there's such a huge literature, well, I guess it's still not that huge, but and a lot of the literature on Central America, recent literature on Central America has been more in anthropology and sociology and other political science disciplines other than history. But certainly we have a much larger literature to work with now than we did when we started graduate school in the 80s. And there were like 4 books that we could read, and then we were on our own. And obviously the situation of the wars and the revolutions and US involvement is part of what had created this kind of explosion in Central American studies, and also the arrival of so many refugees from Central America. But as I finished graduate school and started teaching, I taught my Central American history class for the first time in 1990 at my first job at Bates College. Central America was still very much part of people's consciousness, but over the past couple of decades, I've realized that all those things that were so formative for those of us who sort of came of age and of political consciousness in the 1980s, they're all ancient history and nobody knows anything about them. And that's why Central America's forgotten history, that it's, and not only US Anglo-Saxon white students who have never learned Central American history or the history of US involvement in Central America, and for whom, Archbishop Romero or, those really such dramatic events from the 1980s just don't register. They've never heard of them. But my Central American immigrant students and the children of Central American immigrants, who form a large portion of my students now, also don't know those histories. And interestingly, my book came out almost at exactly the same time as Roberto Lovato's book called Unforgetting. And he is a Salvadoran American and writes about how his family's history had been sort of erased, and which is exactly what my students say. I know my parents came here, but I don't know why, and they don't want to talk about why. They don't want to talk about the past. And when Roberto's book when I first saw it, I thought, oh no, he wrote the same book I did, and he probably did it a lot better than me. But actually, his book is totally different from mine. So I would see them as complementary books. I could certainly see teaching them together, but they don't. He didn't preempt me in terms of the book. So, so one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to have something to teach with. Because in this explosion of literature, a lot of it is very academic and scholarly and not accessible to an undergraduate audience. So, so that was part of my goal, was to try to restore this history to something that could be taught easily in an undergraduate survey class. But the other thing was trying to understand, why is it that after the wars ended, we start having such a huge rise in migration from Central America? So if there was one question that motivated me to write the book, and I was just saying to Aldo that he and I were discussing this topic way back when I was first starting to conceive the book, and I think he was the one who framed it to me that way. Like, what's the connection? Okay, so that is what I'm trying to figure out in this book. Like, what is the connection? So in graduate school, I think a lot of us were asking, well, why are these revolutions happening? And so I needed to go back to that question, even though I feel like the historiography has kind of answered that question, but it's certainly not common knowledge. So I wanted to go back to that question, why are the revolutions happening? But then the sort of bigger question, why did the revolutions, the crushed revolutions, lead to migration? So to sort of go over the larger history and then to contextualize that question specifically, I look at obviously the long history of US relations with Central America, which is part of the cause of the revolutions of the 1980s, and especially the economic development models that the United States has imposed or encouraged. And I say imposed or encouraged because while the United States has certainly promoted these economic development models, it's been in alliance with significant sectors of Central American society, Central American elites. So there's both internal things happening in Central America, but the United States is also playing a big role. So I think there's been a consistency over time, although also changes over time in the US economic development model based on an export economy and an openness to foreign investment in an export economy. So I look at different stages of this, the 19th, early first half of the 20th century period where US investment involvement is mostly in the promotion of a export economy in the growth of coffee, in the interior, bananas on the Atlantic coast, and that is the industry that is really completely under the control of US foreign corporations, although the US is the main export market for coffee too, even though they aren't as, US companies aren't as involved in the production of coffee. So coffee, bananas, and to a lesser extent during this period, mining. And again, US mining companies, and some of them are the same companies. And this is also what's the period that's sometimes understood as the second conquest in Central America in terms of indigenous communities that had maintained during the Spanish colonial period and during the first decades after independence, a fair degree of control over communal lands and autonomy in terms of internal governance. So the second conquest in terms of this assault politically on indigenous autonomy and economically in terms of indigenous lands that are needed, especially for the growing of coffee. And of course, you see different types of resistance to the growth of this export economy and especially to the taking of campesino, peasant, and indigenous lands. And there is, and this is a whole issue that I spend time talking about in the book, the overlap between the categories of indigenous and peasant, or indígena, campesino, an issue that I'm also exploring in the book I'm currently working on. Leading to the first US military occupations in Nicaragua for several decades, 1912 to 1933. And in the context of course, the US invasions of Cuba and Puerto Rico in 1898, long military occupations in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, this era that we call dollar diplomacy, where Central America, either through collaboration or through direct military occupation, comes under the political control of the United States as well. So this economic development model has a political side to it as well, in part because of peasant resistance and to make sure that peasant resistance is crushed. And so in the case of Nicaragua, the United States is kind of doing this directly. In the case of El Salvador, the United States really doesn't need to have very direct control over the military governments there. And as we see in the 1932 massacre that Aldo has also worked on in El Salvador, there's a government that, not because it's controlled by the United States, but for its own reasons, is carrying out policies that are agreeable to to the United States. The United States doesn't have to get militarily involved because its interests are not being threatened, because the Salvadoran government itself is making sure that peasant resistance and radicalism is crushed very quickly. After World War II, we enter what I call the Cold War phase of US relations with Central America. And we can see this in large part in terms of a US response to the Cuban Revolution, successful revolution that really overturns this model of US hegemony, which in Central America and the Caribbean, the United States has very successfully imposed during the first half of the 20th century, despite the constant need for military help to making sure that it remains stable. They love stability as long as they're in charge. They like instability when someone else is in charge, as we saw in Nicaragua in the 1980s. Once the Sandinista revolution was successful, all of a sudden the United States didn't like stability anymore. They wanted instability. But they call it stability, this nice euphemism for US control. But the Cuban Revolution was successful. The United States failed to overthrow it, either through economic means, through counterinsurgency, or through direct military intervention, as in the Bay of Pigs. And US counterinsurgency policy towards Central America, the Caribbean, and expanding to all of Latin America, the Cold War policy, is really a two-pronged policy. One is the military side of counterinsurgency, of working with right-wing forces, training paramilitaries, increasing military aid, promoting virulent anti-communism, overturning labor movements that are feared to be too radical, infiltrating and overturning peasant movements. But the other side of counterinsurgency is a renewed push for economic development, which shares some characteristics with the earlier period, but also brings in some new elements. It's still based on the idea of attracting foreign investment. It's still based on the idea of promoting an export economy and economic growth, which many have critiqued. The concept of economic growth that many have critiqued in the context of Latin America, that economic growth can often be very deleterious to the majority of the population. And we need to separate ourselves from this idea that economic growth, oh, that's a good thing because it helps people. Sometimes it helps people, sometimes it helps some people. In the context of Central America, economic growth has often been extremely harmful, especially to subsistence peasants, also to workers, because economic growth means that workers need to be exploited more so that they can produce more and get paid less. That's what brings economic growth. So yeah, we need to, some of these terminologies of economic growth, economic development, that we've been sort of taught to think of as uniformly positive things. Think about, well, positive for whom and whose exploitation are they actually based on? So this meant not only encouraging foreign investment, but US government programs to encourage agricultural expansion of agro-export industries, in particular, the cotton industry and the beef cattle industry. And if you remember, several decades ago, we kept hearing about how all McDonald's hamburgers were coming from Central America. Well, there were reasons for that. Our tax money was going to fund the construction of things like roads and fertilizers and slaughterhouses, all to develop a Central American cattle industry. Now, of course, for small-holding peasants, this kind of economic development means that they are once again subject to perhaps a third conquest in terms of land loss, displacement, dispossession, and being forced into work in the export economy, in the case of cotton, there's a huge demand for labor, and anybody who's read Roberta Menchu's testimony has read about what it was like as a child to be taken to the cotton plantations and laboring in the cotton plantations. In the case of cattle, it doesn't even require that much labor. So people are simply thrown into dispossession and poverty. So we see a huge exodus from rural areas into urban areas, but there are no jobs for people in urban areas. And so this is the period when not only in Central America, everywhere in Latin America, there's a huge growth in informal communities, which have different kinds of names in different countries, but on the outskirts of the major cities, of people who are pushed out of rural areas, but there's no infrastructure or access or services available or jobs available for them in the urban areas. So, of course, there is resistance in this period also, and in many ways, these land struggles and labor struggles caused by this influx of aid for the new development model have a lot to do with the revolutionary movements that emerged in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Kind of the transition between these two periods, I guess I would say, was Guatemala in the 1950s, when the old period military government is overthrown, dictatorship, and there's the 10 years of spring from 1944 to 1954, where in this case in Guatemala, there's a successful US intervention to overthrow the reformist elected government. So the United States isn't as shaken in 1954 as it is in 1959 in Cuba, when it actually fails to overthrow the revolutionary government. But from a US perspective, everything is now constructed in a Cold War lens. So almost any kind of reformism, especially in the area of land reform and labor rights, is seen as a sign of communism and in need of heavy-duty counterinsurgency to overthrow it. So the revolutionary movements of this time, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, they're not identical, but they are inspired by similar histories, similar labor and peasant struggles, and similar visions inspired by Marxism, not generally led by, or sometimes not even having room for, the actual communist parties, Soviet-affiliated communist parties of these countries, because the Soviet Union is still very much in a let's collaborate with bourgeois governments, and armed revolution is not on the agenda in Latin America. So the actual communist parties, Soviet-affiliated, Comintern-affiliated communist parties, don't play a big role in these revolutions, nor did it in the Cuban Revolution. But certainly Marxist-inspired critiques of the kind of capitalism that has been developing in Central America. All of the revolutionary movements, I guess I would say, shared a vision of state-led redistributive policies. All of them had a program of land reform and prioritizing the rights of peasants and workers, so labor reforms and land reforms. And these are precisely what are seen as communist and threatening to the economic development model that the United States is so intent on promoting in Central America. So the 1980s is the period of the crushing of these revolutions, and this is done with a horrific and spectacular amount of violence, and much of which made its way into the US press. There were also really strong solidarity movements throughout the United States, both with immigrants and refugees, and also with the revolutionary movements. There were all kinds of sister city projects begun. Tens of thousands of US Americans traveled down to Central America, to the rebel-held zones in El Salvador, to work in solidarity with the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, to experience for themselves what it, and of course the Catholic Church was deeply involved with liberation theology. The Maryknoll order based in the United States was really involved. So there were all of these different ways in which people in the United States had a consciousness of what was going on in Central America, and also a sense of outrage at especially violence against unarmed civilians, against political activists, journalists, students, and religious people. So I could talk a lot more about all of this, but I'm not going to, because now I'm really getting to the meat of what the book is about. That's just the background. But by 1990, or by the early 1990s, so the United States has essentially been successful in crushing all of these revolutionary movements in different ways. In Nicaragua, under the constant threat of US embargo, continuing US embargo and US direct warfare against the Nicaraguan people. The anti-Sandinista candidate promoted by the United States is elected in 1990, Violeta Chamorro. In El Salvador, peace treaties are signed in 1992, in Guatemala in 1996. These peace treaties did succeed in opening the political system in the countries, but they did not significantly address the actual causes of the wars in terms of land distribution, economic structures, economic systems, labor rights, etc. But the coming of peace in the 1990s really opened the doors to the full-fledged assault of what we could call the third phase of the US economic development project for Central America, the neoliberal phase of the economic development project. So I want to describe that a little bit, but it's really the absolute crushing of the left of any hope of organized resistance, and not just any hope of organized resistance, but also of the hope in the leftist project of bringing about a different kind of social order that that allows the onslaught of neoliberal policies with only very scattered and weak resistance given the repression that has taken place over the past 15 years. So what is this neoliberal process? And it's going on all over the world, not only in Central America, but because of the particulars of the Central American case, it's like they get the worst of everything in terms of savage neoliberalism. The end of any hope of state-led economic development. Instead, the state, every kind of protection that the state could give to the population has to be eliminated because it is an obstacle to foreign investment and to the so-called free market. So that means that governments can't do things like enforce minimum wages, enforce union rights. Obviously, land reforms have to be dismantled and land has to be thrown open onto the free market. This is why we call it kind of the fourth conquest, is the neoliberal era of conquest. Everything has to be the free market, and the free market means basically the corporate controlled market, because individual people have no freedom in the context of the free market. It's only when the state can serve as kind of a counter to corporate power that peasant organizations, worker organizations, people can have some say in how their society is run. So government cutbacks in social services, privatization of essential services like healthcare, pensions, access to water, what they call free trade, and the Central America Free Trade Agreement is passed in 2005, goes into effect after that, and then becomes CAFTA-DR when the Dominican Republic is added in. But free trade basically meaning very complex rules of trade that are set up to protect investors against any kind of popular opposition or voice or protest. the creation of investor-state dispute settlement courts, so that basically, if there's any challenge to a foreign investor, or anything like environmental contamination, environmental destruction, that or any attempt to change the conditions of investment by doing things like passing labor legislation, environmental legislation, these business-friendly courts have the power to decide. So states basically give up their sovereignty altogether to the global corporate sector. Also, Central American markets are thrown open to dumping of things like corn, which have traditionally been subsistence crops, but then they can be undersold. Any protections for peasant farmers have to be removed. So there's certain sectors, like once again, there's particular sectors of this export economy that are really thrown a lot of US government investment into. The maquiladora sector, if you're familiar with that, the export processing sector. We hear about that more on the US-Mexico border, but it spread throughout Central America in the first decade of the 2000s. Textile, clothing, garment, pharmaceutical, electronics industries that outsource their labor-intensive processes to countries where they don't have to obey US labor and environmental regulations, so they can produce more cheaply, and then they import the final products back into the United States. New forms of non-traditional agriculture. It's an odd term because every generation there's a new type of agriculture that's added, but in particular, fruits and vegetables for the US market, things like broccoli, snow peas. Look at them next time you go to the supermarket, you'll see product of Guatemala, product of Honduras. Tourism, mining, and new sectors related to not only fossil fuels, but also green sectors like palm oil that are supposed to serve as biofuels, alternatives to fossil fuels. So we managed to exploit Central America both to create emissions and also supposedly to be more green and stop emissions. So yeah, we could think of this as the fourth conquest, as some scholars have named it, in terms of the assault on collective rights, communal lands, and peasant subsistence. So how does this model lead us to, and the role of non-governmental organizations, I also just want to mention in the neoliberal model. Now that the state is not able to provide any services to the population, there's a huge influx of NGOs, many of them from the United States, providing great employment for professionals from the United States to basically oversee public services, or what should be public services, the privatization of public services. And again, not only in Central America, but Central America being the backyard of the United States and having this centuries-long tight relationship is kind of an extreme example of how this neoliberal economic model is implemented. So the proliferation of NGOs that kind of take the place of both leftist political organizing, that is organizing for actual social change, and of government provision of services. So it's a different kind of privatization, but it's still a kind of privatization. So how does all of this lead to migration, which is now getting to like the reason that I wrote the book? Revolution, violence, and the roots of migration. So, I mean, it seems really clear to me that it is the destruction of the revolutionary projects that opens the doors to what I call savage neoliberalism. But so what is the role of migration here? And I think it's tied up in a number of different ways. One, as I mentioned earlier, the loss of any hope of bringing about positive social change, for equality, for a different kind of economic development that is really in the interests of the poor, that was so motivating to so many people from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, like the idea that another world is really possible and that we can create it in our countries. The crushing of that over the period of several decades, the death of so many leaders, whether military or social or intellectual leaders, including, of course, the murder of the 6 Jesuits at the University of Central America in El Salvador in 1989, which is kind of like the last blow against any hope of social change in Central America. Or perhaps the last hope was the killing of the Archbishop Juan Gerardi in Guatemala after the release of the Church Human Rights Report on human rights violations during the many decades of war in Guatemala. That was in 1996. So yeah, as the title of William Blum's book on US interventions abroad was called, Killing Hope, certainly is one factor that has led people to think my only hope is to save myself, to migrate, to find an individual solution to what is really a collective problem. But in some ways, I think migration is a collective solution. So I want to talk more about that too. The wars, of course, uprooted many people. The economic development model uprooted many people, but the wars also uprooted many people. So once those collective ties to land and home and village are broken, subsequent migrations become much easier. So we see this over and over again. People migrate maybe to the capital city, maybe to a refugee camp. It's impossible to go home. They try going home and it doesn't work. They've already left once. It's easier to leave again. So all of the displacement and uprooting of the war also is one of the factors that leads us to the context of migration. The NGO projects of trying to fund local development also have been shown to be diverted into migration, because what kind of local small-scale economic development project in an extremely poor and isolated area is actually going to bring returns? It seems much more logical to invest that money, if you can get a loan, a micro loan from one of these NGOs, to invest it in going north, where you know you can get a job and actually have something to support your family and your community. So a lot of NGO money has actually been diverted into funding migration. And this also creates a cycle. Migration itself creates a cycle of debt. And further migration, because many families go into serious debt to send a family member to the United States. And in order to pay back that debt, if for some reason the family member who they sent can't do it, maybe they don't make it to the United States, maybe they're injured, maybe they decide to abandon their family once they've gotten there, they have to keep sending more people. So debt, the cycle of debt just funds more and more and more migration. Migration also follows chains. That is, the refugees who came during the 1980s began chains that once there are somebody there who you know or who your cousin knows, it becomes easier to follow them. And so we get the transplantation of whole villages into different economic sectors, different agricultural sectors, different cities and towns in the United States. So the chain migration that President Trump talked about in such derogatory terms, chain migration has been happening ever since migration has been happening, which is ever since human history has been happening. It's not something new that Trump just invented. He just kind of weaponized it. And it was so shocking. Like, this is something we've been talking about for a long time. Why does Trump suddenly think it's something to like make it sound so terrible? But yeah, so chain migration. Migration has also really served as a safety valve to allow savage neoliberalism to continue its assault on Central America. Because if people are able to leave, and this is why the United States, one of the reasons why the United States has such contradictory policies towards migration, the system relies on people being able to leave and send home remittances. Remittances are the largest source of income in several Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador. When Kamala Harris went to Guatemala, she reiterated President Biden's promise of $4 billion of aid over 4 years. Well, Guatemalans send home $9 billion in remittances every year. So remittances are really what allow this exploitative system to continue. That is, Central Americans work under exploitative conditions in the United States. They send the money back to Central America so that their families can survive working for exploitative conditions for US corporations in their home countries. So it's really a kind of a vicious cycle, but migration is an absolutely essential part of it. And finally, migration frees up land for economic development. For hydroelectric projects, for palm oil plantations, for petroleum exploration. They need land, companies need access to land, and outmigration basically serves corporate interests. So the United States government, while talking a big line about how they're against migration, knows very well that not only is migration necessary to allow profit making to continue as it is in Central America, but Central American migrant labor is absolutely essential to the US economy as well. And the neoliberal US economy, because we too have been subject to the onslaught of neoliberalism since the 1990s, which includes cutbacks in public services, privatizations, has made us in this country also much more dependent on exploited cheap labor for the kinds of services that every single person in this country, rich, poor, immigrant, native, daughters of the American Revolution, everybody depends on undercompensated, exploited service economy, whether it's in agriculture, in the food that we eat, whether it's produced in California or in Mexico or in Central America, whether it's for the Ubers that we take, the restaurants that we eat in. No person in this country can go through their daily lives without benefiting from exploited labor of Central Americans in their own countries or in this country. So I guess I would say that's part of why the United States has contradictory policies towards migration, and the policies are quite contradictory in many ways. But the other thing I would say is that Central Americans have sought to solve their own problems for many, many, many decades. And every time they try to solve their own problems, the United States comes down on them and says, oh no, we have to invade because you're doing it wrong. And in some ways, if we look at the rebellions and banditry that provoked US interventions in the early part of the century, if we look at the so-called communism, the revolutions that provoked US interventions in the second half of the 20th century, now it's migrations that are provoking US interventions. And our response to migration in Central America has been very much a militarized response, which I can get more into later as well. But really, migration is, having exhausted other alternatives, Central Americans, in some ways, very successful attempt to solve the problem of economic development that is caused by the US policies to begin with. So rather than saying we're going to stop migration and solve Central America's problems, I think it would behoove the United States to recognize, oh, Central Americans are actually figuring out ways to solve their own problems. And I can talk about what I think some constructive US policies towards Central America would be, if anyone wants to ask me about that in the questions. But I think I will stop here to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. And the other issue that I didn't talk about, in case anybody wants to ask about, is the issue of climate change, the relation of climate and migration. So I have a lot to say about that too, but I have a lot to say about everything. So anything you want to ask me about, I'm happy to discuss.
Okay, excellent. Less than 50 minutes. So the chat room is open, and if you raise your hand, I will call on you, and you unmute yourself if you want to verbally present your question. I have a question to begin with while we wait for people to process. I'm a bit surprised. This is really a historian's talk. And I thought you would focus a lot more on for example, the security, anti-drug, anti-terror, security policies and spending of the amorphous gang state mafia, no offense to the state organized crime, connections that the US has either encouraged or tolerated, and having to do with the more recent indictment and arrest of the Honduran ex-president, and also with the more recent much more explicitly framed refugee self-presentation of especially Honduran migrants through Mexico from the beginning. So there's the new phenomenons and the new mix of origin places connectable to to the other forms of connected violence, but yet they have new expressions and perhaps even more complicated and unreformable kind of. So it's not really a question. It's just like that would have been another chapter, I guess, right? If you could talk a little bit about that, and then I'll quietly call on the next person if I have a next person in queue.
Okay, so yeah, you heard me mention 3 countries over and over again, right? Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And I'm not sure I mentioned Honduras at all. So I should say something about that. During the 1980s, the revolutions were happening in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. And I say the Sandinista revolution triumphed in 1979, but from a Latin American perspective, a revolution isn't like the date that the revolution triumphs. In a way, that's the day the revolution begins, because the revolution is the transformations that the revolutionary governments want to bring about. So I would say the Nicaraguan revolution is very much happening in the 1980s. Honduras, I guess I can share my map with you for just a second because it suddenly becomes relevant. Just for a second. So Honduras, you will see very conveniently borders Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And during the 1980s, Honduras basically was turned into a country-sized US military base for carrying out US counterinsurgency against Nicaragua, against El Salvador, and against Guatemala. So Honduras was certainly part of the US 1980s project, but it served a somewhat different role. There were protest movements and leftist movements in Honduras, and the United States collaborated with right-wing governments to crush those very effectively, but there was never a large-scale revolution like there was in the other 3 countries. So when I was writing the book, I have several chapters at the beginning that give historical background on all the countries. And then I moved to the ninth period of the 1980s. I have a chapter on Nicaragua, a chapter on El Salvador, a chapter on Guatemala. And then I needed to talk about Honduras, but I originally had my chapter on Honduras in now I can't even remember where I put it, because I changed it so many times. Yeah, I originally had my chapter on Honduras in the neoliberal era, the section of my book that I call After William Blum, Killing Hope. And then I just kept thinking about it. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I have to put a chapter on Honduras back in the section on the Cold War era and the revolutions of the 1970s and 80s. But the reason I had put Honduras in the neoliberal era is, of course, because of the 2009 coup. That is direct US military intervention to overthrow a leftist government doesn't actually end, of course, after the 1980s. And Honduras is the most recent example in Central America, at least, where a very slightly moderately reformist government is elected into power, Manuel Zelaya, and under our liberal slash neoliberal first African-American President Obama, of course, US policy towards Central America does not get any better. And so in the coup in 2009, the United States kind of quietly supports and loudly applauds when Zelaya is overthrown and bringing the far right back into power, and along with the far, so you know, that was sort of the latest challenge to neoliberalism, and that also the 2009 coup is when we really start seeing a flood of refugees and the repression that follows the coup, both the repression and the economic destruction that follow the coup. Economic destruction from the perspective of the poor, that we start seeing a huge outflow of refugees from Honduras. Prior to that, Honduras really did not play a big role in outmigration from Central America. It was primarily Guatemala and El Salvador, starting in the 1980s and continuing through the 1990s and up until 2009. Nicaragua still plays a much smaller role in migration. And I think that in some ways, you know, I've been talking about the crushing of revolutionary projects, but having succeeded in actually taking state power, the Sandinista revolution made some significant structural changes that outlasted this period of the Sandinistas in power. The creation of a new army that really broke the relationship of the army with the tiny elite and created more of a people's army. The constitution, the land reform, the sense among people that they have a say in their country, so that despite the economic suffering that Nicaragua is undergoing, we're not seeing the kind of floods of refugees fleeing Nicaragua that we've seen, that we see in especially Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Those are the three biggest sources of migrants today.
Okay, our colleague Mark Wasserman has a question.
Just got to unmute. Hi, nice to see you, Aviva. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit. You started a minute ago on the two left of center regimes since 2000 that have pretty much dominated in their countries. One is the returned Sandinistas, who have Ortega is now on what, his fourth term. And I'd like you to comment upon the criticisms that have been levied against the second stage Sandinistas of basically conducting a reign of terror on their own population. And also comment upon the fact that Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the hemisphere, having been ruled, and I mean ruled, not governed, over the last 14 years, 15 years, by a purportedly revolutionary government. The second would be the Salvadorans. I was a little curious that you used the word crushed on the part of the left, when the Farabundo Martí had 2 consecutive presidents of El Salvador. That's at least 8 years. And so I'm wondering how you fit that into your narrative, because when we're dealing with these things, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with much of what you've said, but on the other hand, you really have to bring in the other. You have to deal with these other aspects. The third thing is more of a comment that we can argue up and down about the neoliberal model. One problem is, what are the choices other than the neoliberal model at this point, having a succession of other models that have failed? But the other has to do with the kind of Cardoso-Lula model of neoliberalism, which includes a key aspect that the Central Americans don't seem to have, which is a mitigation of the worst aspects of it. Kind of, I don't know, pushing the model, maybe a New Deal, to take away the toughest parts by and redistributing income. And certainly in the Brazilian model, it did work, at least for a while, and cut the poverty rate in half. Anyway, I don't want to go on anymore, but.
So those are all really good questions, and I could talk for an hour on any one of them, but I'll try to say a little bit about all of them quickly. So the re-election of Daniel Ortega several times, and his measures, both economic and political measures that seem to contradict the Sandinista revolutionary ideology. Is he a post-Sandinista? Is he as bad as Somoza? Is he just another personalist dictator at this point? How repressive is he? You called them second stage Sandinistas, and I actually kind of like that. But I actually kind of want to connect. So, like, obviously, in the eyes of the US government, Daniel Ortega is a tyrant. He's a brutal dictator. He, like, every word that we like to use against official enemies is constantly levied against Daniel Ortega. And certainly the Daniel Ortega of today is not the same in terms, I mean, he's the same person, and a lot of accusations that have been made against him, especially in his personal life, go all the way back to the period of the 1980s. So I don't want to say he's not the same person, because he is the same person. But I think that it's very hard to have a nuanced conversation on the left about what the Sandinistas represent today in Nicaragua, and how to avoid falling into the demonization that the US right is intent on making of Daniel Ortega, how to recognize that he continues to enjoy a fair degree of popular support in Nicaragua, that certainly he's not a, it's very difficult, although, I could also argue that it's always been very difficult to turn him into as kind of an idealized revolutionary hero. But I guess I would partly ask, and I also think that one of the things that's happening on the left is some introspection and perhaps self-critique at the idealized hopes that we in the left in the United States placed on the Sandinista revolution. And I almost feel like this is yet another imperial internalized imperial set of ideas that we need to struggle against. That is, not only do we want Central American products and profits from Central America, but we also want Central Americans to fulfill our revolutionary hopes. Like, we know we can't have a revolution here. We don't have any politicians that we like here. We can't even hope to change our own society. So we want the Central Americans to do it for us. It's kind of like in the climate accords, where all the rich countries say, oh, let's make sure the poor countries stop emitting CO2, because we're not going to do it. So we want them to do it for us. So, you know, although I certainly partook of this kind of romanticization of the Central American revolutions of the 80s, I also critique it in the sense that of our own political impotence and hopelessness here, that we want the Central Americans to do it all for us and be those perfect revolutionaries who can create the ideal society that we don't think we can do. So I do think that part of the disillusionment of the left with Daniel Ortega is that he didn't live up to our expectations of what we wanted the revolution to do. But I also want to connect this to your last comment about, so what choice do they have? And connect that to the FMLN in power as well, which you were also doing. So I think there is also a significant critique from the left in El Salvador and from some of the popular movements in El Salvador. I mean, I think the FMLN in power, certainly there's been steps that they took in government, really progressive steps, and the ban on metallic mining is a big one, where they actually worked with popular movements, anti-extractivist movements, and the ban on metallic mining, I think, was a really important victory for some of the popular movements. That couldn't have happened without the FMLN in power. But, you know, you said that Nicaragua is the second poorest country of the hemisphere, and that is, you know, sometimes gets measured differently. Honduras is really poor, Haiti is really poor, Bolivia is really poor. You know, you see different numbers, but basically, yes, Nicaragua is very poor. Certainly, the Contra War had a lot to do with impoverishing Nicaragua. Nicaragua was poor before that. But I would also say that, so what choice do leftist governments have in power? They can implement redistributive kinds of measures, which, as you pointed out, the Cardoso-Lula model, the New Deal model. Every leftist government in power of the pink tide has been severely criticized from the left because it has continued to rely on extractivism, that is the extraction of natural resources, on collaboration with foreign investors, which means also things like maintaining the conditions that foreign investors want. And again, I would ask, what choice do they have that is the global environment is very adverse to any kind of redistributive measures that, in order for redistribution to be meaningful, you have to have something to redistribute. So where are you supposed to get that from if you're not giving in to the global economy and to the interests of foreign investors in some ways? That is, Latin America lacks the infrastructure, it lacks the capital. And here I could also connect to some of what I was thinking about in terms of what would positive US policies be toward Latin America or toward Central America, which I don't think anything that President Biden has suggested goes anywhere in the right direction. It's more about, let's promote more of the same. But I won't talk about all of the, well, maybe I'll just quickly go through my list of things that, like, how could the United States actually contribute towards a more potential for equitable and equitable redistribution and a different kind of economic development for Latin America. So a couple of different areas that where I think just the decks are so stacked against poor countries that the United States plays a big role in. One is trade rules. Whether through the World Trade Organization, whether through the various free trade agreements, they're completely stacked against allowing any poor country, including the Central American countries, to do what is equitable and what is best for their people. So overturning the global trade arrangements. Debt. Central American governments, like all poor countries, are severely constricted on what kinds of economic policies they can implement because of debt and the restrictions then imposed on them by international financial institutions. So a debt jubilee is another global level policy that we could look to, again, rather than, and this is where I see that kind of internalized imperial thought, rather than expecting Central American governments to be able to dig them out of the holes that we buried them in, to think about what do we need to do at a global level to allow Central American governments to create better economic policies for their populations. Another thing we could do is to raise the minimum wage in the United States. Given the incredibly important role that remittances play in Central America's economies, raising the minimum wage in the United States would significantly increase the capacity of Central American governments to experiment with different kinds of redistributive policies and have more to work with. And finally, and this takes me into the climate question too, which I think somebody said they were going to ask. The impact of climate change on Central America and on Central American migration is almost incalculable. And the ways that climate change is ensuring that no equitable economic development can take place in Central America at all. Like, in addition to the debt and the trade rules, climate change also makes it practically impossible for a Central American government to say, oh, well, given what we have, we're going to do it right. So the severe impacts of droughts, of hurricanes, of coffee rusts, of agricultural destruction, of making subsistence impossible. So, that is really actually our fault. Like, we are at fault for climate change. And every time we go to a meeting, we try to say that somebody else is at fault, but really we are at fault. We're the largest consumer of fossil fuels. We are not reducing our emissions. And we're in fact promoting economic development models at home and abroad that are increasing the use of fossil fuels and emissions everywhere. And
could you develop a little bit on how that then changes migration? Because a student asked about that, and the connections are not that obvious.
How climate change changes migration?
Yeah, the environmental piece, including the larger environmental piece, which also includes the mining and other resource issues, right?
So it's a really tangled web, I would say, environmental issues and migration. Of course, environmental destruction is one of the causes of migration. If people are either pushed off their land to make room for economic development projects, for deforestation, for export agriculture, for mining, for hydroelectric projects, they end up being pushed into a migrant stream. One of the ways that the United States, and not only the United States, European countries, have tried to flatten their emissions curves has been through outsourcing, through the maquiladora industries, through the outsourcing not only of the most directly environmentally destructive and labor-intensive portions of their industrial production, but also of their emissions-causing portions, so that we do not count emissions of what we consume. We only count emissions of what we produce. So the more European countries and the United States, and this is part of the neoliberal world order, is this outsourcing. So it's labor, it's environment, but it's also emissions, which of course are connected to environment, but in two different ways. That is, most countries, no country actually regulates its emissions. The countries do regulate local environmental, clean air, clean water, local forms of environmental destruction. But in terms of emissions, we measure them, but we don't regulate them. So we can make it look like our emissions are going down. And when I say we, I mean the other industrialized countries, so-called industrialized countries, Europe as well, make it look like our emissions are going down by outsourcing, so that countries like Vietnam and China and El Salvador get blamed for the emissions of what we're actually consuming. Even if it's US companies, not in the case of China, but US companies, well, even in the case of China, profiting from, even if they aren't running the companies, or even if US companies own the production facilities in other countries, the other countries get counted. So the outsourcing of our dirty industries. Our supposedly clean energy initiatives also are causing immense environmental destruction in Central America and everywhere in the third world. Where do we get the materials to make the solar panels? Where do we get the lithium for the batteries? All this talk about electrification and clean energy, where do we get the metals? Where do we get, it's all resource-based. And a lot of it is fossil fuel-based. Like, even if you're not mining coal, whatever you're mining, you're still using fossil fuels to mine it. You're not running those trucks with solar power. So what we call clean energy is actually extremely emissions heavy, and a lot of those emissions and the environmental destruction are happening in the third world, including in Central America. And palm oil is just one example where deforestation and plantation agriculture, in the so-called interest of the environment and of lowering emissions in the United States, because we use it as an agro-fuel here, and we can say, oh, well, we're emitting less, even though the overall emissions may be even worse because of the impacts that those are having in Central America. So those are obviously connected to migration as well. So all economic development increases emissions. So if Central Americans come to the United States and consume more, because here they have to have a car to drive, here they're consuming more processed foods, they're buying more things, and they're sending more things home, and they're sending money home so that people can buy more things. So this is economic development, right? This is economic growth. Economic development and economic growth cause emissions. And the more emissions we cause, the worse the effects of climate change are. So that's yet another complicated way that migration is related to emissions. All of the policies that our current administration is trying to put into place, the so-called good policies, as opposed to the supposedly bad policies of the Trump administration, Biden is basically continuing all of the bad policies of the Trump administration in terms of militarization of the border, in terms of outsourcing of the border, militarization of the Mexico-Guatemala border, militarization of the Guatemala-Honduras border. So the outsourcing of US border policy and the military involvement in Central America and Mexico, Biden's continuing all of those things. All of the things we hated so much when Trump did them, like Title 42 and like Remain in Mexico, Biden's still doing them. We just don't talk about them anymore because we're supposed to like the Democrats and we're not supposed to like Trump.
Okay.
But Biden is also returning to what Trump pulled back from, which is investment in so-called economic development, which is also very climate unfriendly types of economic development that they're trying to promote in Central America. So the money that's going to supposedly economic development project also has climate impacts, of course. And another thing that promotes migration, so I guess I would say the last thing is our domestic policies that promote high consumption in the United States are also a migration pull. that is, when we go around the world advertising how much stuff we have here, well, of course, people want to come and get access to some of that stuff. So as long as we continue to promote this high consumption ideal of American exceptionalism and an American standard of living, we are creating a model that we are enticing everyone in the world to want to follow. So, looking inward and reducing our own use of fossil fuel and abandoning this idea of an American standard of living, and thinking about climate change as the emergency that it is, requiring drastic changes in the way our economy functions, I think that that is really a key tool towards global economic equality and allowing people to stay home. Because while I have been speaking in positive terms about migration, I also believe very firmly in, to quote the title of David Bacon's book, in the right to stay home. And that's what we have deprived people of, is the right to stay home. And I say we in terms of all the things that I've been talking about, but also in terms of our high consumption fossil-based commitment to the way the country functions.
I'm gonna post a link to an article by my colleague Lee Binford on the high costs and negative impacts of migration in home communities and families that are left behind. Jennifer, you had a question.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Aviva. I have heard of you first through activism networks, people that we both know in Central America and Colombia. And so nice to meet you on Zoom. And then of course, later learned about all of or started reading your fantastic books. And I have a lot of students here from my Mexico and Central America class and from my Intro to Latin America class. And I wanted to kind of pose a question about, this goes back to the 80s, but I think it's still relevant today since we're still stuck in Cold War ideas and ideologies, which is that we keep talking about the US interventions as ways of preventing communism, as ways of preventing Soviet, at the time, Soviet intervention in our quote unquote backyard. And we keep coming back to this idea of do the ends justify the means? But I feel, and I've been thinking about it, and I feel like that really kind of undermines this whole idea. It kind of like puts together all these ideas of popular movements, popular reforms, labor movements, etc., kind of just flattens them out into communism. And so I'm wondering how, you commented on that a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, and also maybe translate to how that's playing out in its kind of new phase under neoliberalism, where we're also still, very much trying to avoid anything that might look at all socialist, right? And by we, I mean the broader US and especially US foreign policy.
That's also a big question, but let me pick up on what you said, and nice to meet you too, about the ends justifying the means. That is, if we frame it that way, we're assuming that there's some good that's coming out of the end. But I think it's only in the furthest reaches of the US power structure that the ends themselves can be justified. That is, if the end is enabling US corporations to make profits, like that's not necessarily an end that most of us in this room would want to get behind, even if the means were not so terrible to having to get there. That's not the end that we want to fight for. So, I think anti-communism has been used to get us as a way of getting us to stop thinking about what are the real ends here. And it's become, I feel like most of my students don't even know that the Cold War ever ended. Like they didn't get that far in their history classes. And since they hear so much about how terrible Russia and China are, they think they just have no idea. So I think that turning communism into a boogeyman has been so hegemonic that it makes it hard to talk about US policies, US foreign policies in any kind of rational way, because it just gets sucked into this. Well, we can't let communism happen because we all know how terrible communism is. Like, do we? What exactly do we know about communism? And so, there's times when communism is just used as as an emotional flashpoint without even knowing what's being talked about. There's times when communism is used as a way of turning people against poor people's movements, peasant struggles for land. Like, oh, well, we don't have to be sympathetic with that because it's communist. And so therefore we automatically have to be against it. So, but in both cases, I feel like it's, I think it's incumbent on us who are teachers to get students to think more deeply about how has communism, the concept of communism, been used to manipulate the way we think about US foreign policy. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey,
I mean, it's still, I feel, or sorry.
Okay, Gabriel, I have a question.
Okay. Yes. Let me see how I explain this. Thank you to all being here. I'm so glad to be part of this conversation. I want to say maybe or make some comments and a question. Okay, I think that maybe we could call this fourth conquest that you was talking about, like the Washington Consensus conquest. And your analysis is framed on this Washington consensus political view of neoliberalism, the less states, free market, for investment, so on. And the beginning of this separation, or maybe the beginning of this separation between real economy and fictitious economic, to use a Marxist concept, or a speculative economy or whatever. And yes, we know it's a capitalism without work or with junk works and so on. This is terrible for the economy. But right now, 40 years later from neoliberalism policies and so on, in this so-called Silicon Valley consensus, with cryptocurrencies, financial capital, huge corporations in high-tech products, and also these offshore regions of the Central America and all Latin America. How we could analyze this reality of migration or economic in Latin America in this new Silicon Valley consensus of 2022 post-capitalism, maybe, to say something, because I think the world changed a lot since the last crisis of 2010, and we are in other stage that it's even worse than what we imagined. And just one thing else, I put here a link about BBC article of garbage imperialism, because right now Latin America became one of the most important market from garbage from United States, since China stopped buying garbage from United States. So, and the Salvador is is the main country that receives garbage from United States, and that involve exploitation of labor and a lot of struggles that the state have to deal later. in terms of environmental problems and social struggles. And sorry about my English, but this is my question for you.
So I agree with you that that we may be in a new phase, but I'm not sure if post-capitalist really works to talk about this new phase, because I think it's eminently capitalist. It's like capitalism on steroids, not post-capitalist in any way. And I would also point out that this current phase of the global economy is in line with all of the older forms of capitalism, extremely fossil fuel heavy and extremely resource heavy. So yes, we can talk about financialization of the economy, speculative economies, but we have not moved away from, in fact, we're getting worse and worse in terms of our reliance on resource extraction. And that includes both fossil fuels and other forms of resource extraction. So, we're not moving into a post-material economy in any way, shape, or form. We are consuming more and more resources. Like, I was just shocked to read this in a couple, like, I should have known this. I just finished writing a book that's coming out in April about climate change. It's called Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. Had to get a pitch for that in there. But 80% of new vehicles that are sold in the United States today are SUVs and light trucks. 80%. So we are not moving away from a materials economy. We are consuming more and more and more materials. And by the way, they are not covered under vehicle emission standards, because those only apply to passenger cars, not to SUVs and light trucks. So that helps to explain why our vehicle emissions keep going up. Yeah, tax subsidized. So I would definitely not say post-capitalist or post-material. But one thing that I would say is that so the climate emergency has also been turned into a profit-making opportunity. So the climate emergency itself is pushing us into a new phase. Even though it's not being acknowledged or dealt with by any sectors in power anywhere in the world, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we do anything about it or not, it is pushing us into a new phase. Exactly where that's going to take us and how it's going to go, like, we can use some science to tell us how it's going to go in material terms. How is it going to go in political and social terms? We don't know, like, what kinds of revolutions, what kinds of migrations, what kinds of political changes is it going to bring? That's why I'm a historian, because I don't like to predict the future. But I mean, I foresee changes happening because of the materiality of the climate emergency. But what you say about garbage imperialism is just another example of how, like, we are not moving away from the materials economy. We are immersing ourselves, like, we are making it worse and worse. So I don't really see a change of direction in how capitalism is going. I just see further exacerbation. And, the crisis that it's already creating for the third world, that is going to be much, much worse in 10 years and in 20 years. What are the political and social consequences of that going to be? I don't know. But I mean, in a way, I feel like all the cryptocurrency, I mean, first of all, the cryptocurrency is also very materials heavy. The mining of Bitcoin is a huge fossil fuel user. So, like, we talk about these things like Silicon Valley as like clean and post-material in some way, but in no way are they clean or post-material. That's just language that we use to make ourselves feel good about it. It's like calling Uber a ride-sharing company.
We have a question from back to the migration theme. Lilia asked a question about the role of the Mexican government in mediating the migration and the refugees and policing its own borders, especially its southern border, as its own policy or as a product of US pressure, or maybe not. So a lot to talk about there. It's one of those new pieces, right, that I referred to. If you could just talk about that briefly.
Yeah, and I think that that also brings me back to Mark Wasserman's question about like what choices do leftist governments have? Mexico is another country that elected a leftist government with a project for social transformation. But, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. What space does Mexico really have to implement autonomous policies when it is so economically dependent on the United States, when it so politically dependent on the United States? So yes, Mexico has a certain degree of autonomy, and we've seen Mexico push the limits of that again and again as far as it can without provoking a terrible reaction from the United States. And Mexico has done, and I'm talking about like over the past century, not just since AMLO was elected. Mexico has done many amazing things and admirable things. But in terms of border policies, I think Mexico has very, very little room for maneuver under US hegemony. So I think that not having any internal access to López Obrador's decision-making process, but I think that he has basically ceded border policy to the US and just decided this is an area where I can't do anything except cede. And so I'm going to try to push progressive policies in other areas, but this is one where there's just no room for maneuver. And that includes both collaborating on the US-Mexico border with repressive policies, including the Remain in Mexico policy, basically outsourcing to Mexico the US border policy. And it also means collaborating with the US on Mexico's southern border to turn the Mexican National Police into an enforcer of US border policy.
Okay, Regina.
Thank you so much for this talk. Discussions like this are so important. As someone who was active in solidarity with Central America in the late 80s and early 90s, I agree with you that it's so heartbreaking that many people today, especially children of Central American migrants, aren't aware of this history. So thank you so much. This discussion has been really wonderful. Towards the end of your discussion, you mentioned that there are ways in which Central Americans are attempting to address some of the problems in their own countries. And you said you would talk about it if there were time in the chat. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So what I was specifically referring to was migration as a solution. That under the circumstances, migration is one of the few routes left for Central Americans to, and the remittances that are sent home with migration, there's been a lot of studies that try to quantify this. So I don't want to give a definitive statement on it because I think it's still a little bit up for grabs. But in many ways, at least, the money that's sent back from remittances has a much more redistributive effect than does the money that's sent through NGOs or through foreign aid. It's not really an effective long-term economic development project. And many of the poorest people actually don't even have the resources to migrate to begin with. So it's not like a perfect redistributive measure. It's not like having a socialist government that actually is going to provide services to, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, from each according to his or her or their ability. But under the circumstances, it is kind of the best option out there right now. in terms of redistributive development policies. So what is remittance money spent on? Some of it is spent, and again, you know, I feel like there's in the literature, there's kind of different literatures talking past each other. So like economic development literature wants remittances to be spent on economically productive activities. But economically productive, like another word for economically productive is environmentally destructive. There's nothing that's economically productive that's not environmentally destructive. So again, like we can't blame Central Americans. We're the ones who are doing the lion's share of the environmental destruction. But if we're looking at economic development, like to say, well, oh, so poor countries have to have sustainable development now that we've had unsustainable development and plan to continue having completely unsustainable development until we're all destroyed. So, you know, it's definitely a colonial attitude for us to look at Latin America and say, oh, we want them to have sustainable development, unlike us. But at the same time, so, you know, in thinking, so again, we have to turn back to ourselves and say, okay, how can we have more equitable redistribution at a global level rather than yelling at Central Americans for trying to get a little bit when we have so much too much. But some of the money is spent on things like education. And some of the money is spent on things like buying guns to kill your neighbors. You know, again, remittances as an economic development policy is not necessarily, let's just all clap and say they solved it because they figured out remittances. But, you know, we need to look at it from all sides. And I guess that what the other thing that I was saying was, rather than saying what Central America should do, given all of the ways that the deck is stacked against it, any Central American government, left, right, center, whatever, is more focusing on the lens on what do we need to do to allow Central Americans to figure out paths that will be even better than the remittance path.
Right, right. I agree with everything you've said. One tangent is that I've always been impressed with the fact that immigrants here, migrants here, who are already at the bottom of the economic sort of pyramid in the United States, who are sending money back to their families, through their hometown associations, they're oftentimes building new schools in their towns, building health centers, doing the kinds of things that government should be doing. And while this is by no means a long-term solution, it's so amazing that people are organizing collectively here to do the kinds of things that can't be done there or aren't getting done there for all kinds of reasons. So I was just curious as to what else you might say on that, but thank you very much for your reply.
I mean, you're absolutely right, and I don't want to downplay that, but it's also unfortunately true that a lot of the money is getting sent back to build giant concrete houses with, you know, indoor plumbing that will never be lived in because everybody's leaving.
Okay, we clearly have a lot of need for these sorts of discussions at Rutgers and elsewhere, so this will be one of many different talks to look forward to. Thank you to the audience who've hung out for this long, amazing, and Avi, who is two more books. Like, okay, next year we'll bring you for another one. Thank you very much, Avi. This has been extremely stimulating, and I'm sure we're going to be buzzing in our heads for a while. For the students, you know, take courses. We have these courses. Talk to us, reach out. And to Avi, keep those books coming.
I will try. Thank you so much.
care.
Thank you for all your questions and your attention.